Physical Science 8.2 Nuclear Energy. What are fusion and fission? How does a nuclear reactor convert nuclear energy into thermal energy? What are the advantages and disadvantages of using nuclear energy to generate electricity? The sun is a giant nuclear reactor in the sky. You see it every day. It transforms energy through a process called fusion. Fusion occurs when atomic nuclei combine at very high temperatures. In this process, a small amount of mass is transformed into a tremendous amount of thermal energy. So there are a couple of concepts that always get confused for this chapter when it comes to fission and fusion. So if I have a nuclei here, okay, let's say it's an egg. Okay, so we have fusion. So we have an egg. Let's say this egg weighs 1 gram. Okay, so through nuclear fusion, I'm taking this egg with 1 gram, and this isn't really exactly accurate, but it's a great way to visualize it if you're having a trouble distinguishing between the two different terms for this chapter. So through nuclear fusion, this and this come together. They no longer exist. They fuse together and they make a single solitary nuclei that's more powerful than either of them were separate. That's a really, really bad way of describing it, but it's a super great visual. Okay? Now, when energy is released, when the nucleus of an atom splits apart in a process called fission, during fission, a small amount of mass is converted into a tremendous amount of thermal energy. Unlike fusion, fission-based power plants are practical. 65 power plants in the U.S., including the one shown above, transform energy by fission reactions. These plants convert nuclear energy into electrical energy and produce 8% of the energy used in the United States. So fission again, not the best example for accuracy science-wise, but for visual, it really makes sense. So again, if we have an egg and the egg is 2 grams and we crack that egg through fission, now we have 2 separate pieces. And from this, you have energy that is released from the fission process that allows us to get our energy.
Certain large nuclei, such as uranium-235, can undergo a change called nuclear fission. During nuclear fission, a nucleus splits into smaller nuclei and energy is released. During the fission of uranium-235, a neutron bombards a uranium-235 nucleus and is absorbed. The nucleus splits, producing nuclei of krypton-92 and barium-141, 3 neutrons, and energy. The neutrons produced bombard other uranium-235 nuclei and the reaction is repeated. Because each fission produces 3 neutrons, the reaction proceeds at an increasing rate. Such an ongoing series of reactions is called a chain reaction and can become uncontrolled. To control this reaction inside a nuclear reactor, rods called control rods are inserted. The rods absorb many of the neutrons produced, so the reaction slows down and can be controlled by the number of rods inserted. Thus, the amount of energy produced by the chain reaction remains at a level that can be used.
So if you think of it this way, if I have a running bath of hot water, okay, and I have a huge bathtub, all right, and I want to maintain a certain temperature in my bathtub, what do I have to keep doing? I have to keep, in the beginning, turning down my cold water, right? Because my hot water is eventually going to start running out. There's only so much hot water you can have if you're on a tank system. Okay, so if I have a 10-gallon hot water tank, Once I hit 10 gallons, it's going to start getting really cold. So I'm going to have to start adjusting the dials. That's what that rod does. It's adjusting and controlling the heat process from that. Very cool stuff.
Located in the nuclear core of a fission reactor are fuel rods, moderator and coolant fluid, and control rods. Each fuel rod contains tiny pellets of uranium dioxide. In these hundreds of fuel rods, fission occurs, producing an average of 2.5 neutrons per fission reaction. The fuel rods are surrounded by water, which acts as a moderator by colliding with the neutrons and slowing them to a low thermal level. The water absorbs the thermal energy, which is used to drive a steam turbine to generate electricity. The low-energy neutrons enter other fuel rods and collide with uranium-235 nuclei, creating additional fission chain reactions and the release of more neutrons. The amount of low-energy neutrons present is regulated by control rods made of boron, which are very effective at absorbing neutrons. These rods are raised out of or lowered into the core.
So I have actually been in a nuclear reactor in Holloway here in Missouri. Very cool stuff. If it wasn't so far away, we would take a trip there. Your rods are actually inserted into all these, see these little cubes? That's where your rods are located, and this is all water.
As needed to sustain the chain reaction at the desired level.
One of the cool things is Mizzou. In Columbia, Missouri, they have a little reactor there. That's also where I was. And what's really cool about that is that they, for the longest time, were in the jewelry business. They made a lot of money taking certain minerals, certain stones, and changing the color of those stones into sapphire, blue sapphires, all kinds of your fake gems. And made a lot of money from it. So nuclear reactors can do so many things: medicine, electricity. The possibilities are absolutely endless, and maybe create a good guy and a bad guy. You know, like villains and superheroes. Anyway. But I digress because I find nuclear stuff just super cool. Okay, so it uses energy from controlled nuclear reactions to generate electricity. Although nuclear reactions vary in design, all reactors share some similarities. They contain fuel that undergo fission. They contain control rods that are used to control the nuclear reactions. They have a cooling system, typically water, that keeps the reactor from being damaged by the enormous amount of heat being produced. And the actual fission of the radioactive fuel occurs in a relatively small part of the reactor known as the core. The core of a nuclear reactor contains the fuel rods as seen here. So this is what you saw. This is what you were seeing right here, but you were seeing it from the top, okay? So this was like the little cubes you saw. So the core of a nuclear reactor contains the fuel rod bundles, this is a bundle. The control rods that absorb neutrons are inserted between the fuel rod bundles. Nuclear power plants produce an electric current in a way that is similar to fossil fuel burning power plants, as shown on the next screen. And here's a picture of that. Your fuel rods, your cooling tower, which we'll look at in another picture. The thermal energy released in fission is used to heat water and produce pressurized steam. To transfer thermal energy from the reactor core, the core contains a fluid coolant. The hot coolant is pumped into a heat exchanger. There, thermal energy is transferred from the hot coolant to water, causing the water to boil and produce pressurized steam that spins a turbine. When the steam leaves the turbine and enters a chamber where it is condensed back into liquid water. Cool water absorbs the thermal energy released during condensation. The thermal energy is then carried to the cooling tower where it is released into the environment.
The process of generating nuclear power begins in the reactor core where water is superheated. The superheated water, which is contained in a pipe, is then pumped through the boiler where it heats more water, producing steam. The steam turns the turbine, which turns the generator. The generator then produces an electric current. The steam is then pumped into the condenser, where it is cooled and changes back into liquid water. The liquid water then goes back to the boiler.
The overall efficiency of nuclear power plants is about 35%, which is similar to that of fossil fuel burning power plants. A nuclear power plant converts water into pressurized steam, as we've already discussed, that spins the turbine. This is what generates electricity. So extracting energy from atomic nuclei is tricky business, right? It has its advantages and disadvantages. Nuclear power plants do not produce the air pollutants that fossil fuel burning power plants release into the atmosphere, which is awesome, right? It's also not using our precious natural resources that are not easily replaced. Also, nuclear power plants do not release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, thus making our greenhouse effect unlivable. Nuclear power plants also have their disadvantages. For example, nuclear power plants are very expensive to build. The building process can take 10 or more years to complete. Nuclear power plants also produce radioactive waste that can be harmful to living organisms and the environment if it's not disposed of properly. I am going to go back here. Not only are they expensive to build, and it takes a while to build them, but they're only able to function for so long. I believe it's 20 to 30 years. When Clinton Power Plant in Illinois, which is where I'm from, it was about 30 minutes from my house, it only had a lifespan of 20 years, and then it takes about 10 years to close down a plant after that. So you're looking at 20 to 30 years max. So it takes 10 years to build it, takes 10 years to dismantle it, and it only can run full capacity for 20 years. So is it cost effective? At this point, not really. But I'm sure with time and technology, that's something that science can improve on.
From an on-site pool to underground, nuclear waste will be stored differently at Ameren, Missouri Callaway Energy Center.
It's absolutely necessary for the continued operation of the Callaway Energy Center.
The nuclear plant serves more than 60 counties. They started moving their nuclear waste from the spent fuel pool into the new cask storage area this week. The fuel will be lowered into the ground in a self-contained canister with a top and bottom cement pad 33 inches thick.
When I was at Callaway, this is what they were in the middle of building and had almost completed it when we were there. Super cool stuff. We walked right on top of it.
Safety-wise, it's less radiation dose that our workers would receive. It's less radiation work that our security force would receive than just walking around the pad itself. Also, if you think about it, we do live in Tornado Alley, so from that aspect, being in the ground is more secure.
This big-looking tank machine behind me is the vertical cask transporter, and it will be used to transport nuclear fuel waste every 3 years. Workers at the plant have...
When they say nuclear fuel waste, they're talking about the rods that you saw in the different animations and the different pictorials in our PowerPoint. Those rods, once they have collected all of the nuclei that they can collect and they're considered quote-unquote full, at that point they're considered nuclear waste. And so whenever they refer to nuclear waste, they're talking about the fuel rods.
Been constructing the dry cask operation for the past 4 years. This is the last stage of the operational phase.
It brings more references to the power plant, which is what we want, so we can put it in operation, get through construction, and put it into service. But it's a good feeling.
The campaign will be complete in about 6 weeks when the 6 canisters are put underground. Reporting in Callaway County, Stephanie Herodic.
Okay, so just to take you through a little bit, you heard about a cooling tower. I'm sure you've seen things on TV, or if you ever go to the area, you can see this somewhat from the road. This cylindrical tower that flanges out at the bottom and also at the top, this is the cooling tower that we talked about in the earlier slides. So after about 3 years of use, the amount of U-235 in the fuel pellets in the reactor core is too small for the chain reaction to continue. So those fuel pellets left are now referred to as spent fuel. The spent fuel includes radioactive fission products in addition to some leftover U-235. Spent fuel is a form of nuclear waste, and that means any radioactive material that results when radioactive materials are used.